All right. Greetings, everybody. So I'm Marguerite Rigoglioso of Seven Sisters Mystery School, and this is another Priestess Dialogue for our times. Today, I'm here with Maura McCarley Torkildson, a longtime friend of mine who's also a sacred woman, who in the last year plus has transformed her work as an author, coach, and an intuitive healer into her work to support formerly incarcerated people to find employment. And so, given that as we are recording, there have been some very, very sad and unfortunate events with yet another brutal murder of an African-American person, George Floyd, as we speak, and then ensuing eruption of emotion and energy and violence in the US and in the world, really. And so Maura and I realized that it would be a good time to bring in her insights and her work, as she has moved from being a priestess who was serving mainly certain kinds of people into working with people of color now, largely, what that has meant in her personal transformation and some teachings that are there for all of us, especially those of us who may not be connected with so much social justice issues in our lives. So first of all, welcome, Maura.
Thank you, Marguerite. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, it's so great to have you. And I want to say that Maura is the author of two books. One is called The Inner Tree, which is about intuition, your own intuition, accessing it. And another is a very beautiful novel called The Curious Magic of Buckeye Groves, which really brings her and you and the reader into the world of nature, the elements, the elemental beings, and the magic therein. So Maura weaves in a lot of different threads. So tell us, Maura, a little bit, like the 5-minute encapsulation of your journey as a sacred woman and how that's led you to the job that you're doing right now. And then we'll really just launch into, what are you seeing, sensing, feeling in the realm of disenfranchised people, and what kinds of things we need to know. So tell us about yourself first.
Yeah, so, so often my journey felt like it was all over the place, actually. I've had so many different, I guess, work that I did in the world. And, throughout all of that, I had a calling to enter into a women's spirituality program, which sort of was the spiritual core of all of my work. And I was thinking this morning, hindsight is so telling, isn't it? We don't always know exactly where we're going. And yet I can see now that everything that I did plays a role in what I'm doing now. So as you know, and maybe some of the people who are listening know, I did the priestess entrepreneur path for a while, and it really wasn't the right place for me. It was very, very stressful. And I wouldn't give it up for the world, because I learned so much from doing that, and I worked through a lot of my own shadows and trauma doing it. But during that time frame, which is about 5 years, I actually volunteered to go into San Quentin for an organization called the California Reentry Institute, CRI. And my piece of that was to go in and to teach the men in that program inside San Quentin about shame and emotions, and the difference between shame and remorse. And I started educating myself about trauma at that time, and so I kept bringing more about that I had learned about trauma into that experience as well. And what I discovered was that I absolutely loved doing that work. And at that time, when I first volunteered, I didn't know that it was leading me here, because I didn't realize that there was actually a job where I could do this work, except for CRI, which was largely a volunteer organization. And I decided to give up my business for the most part, and started looking for work. And I ran across the organization that I work for now, which is called Center for Employment Opportunities. And there was a job opening, and so I jumped on it, and here I am. So I've been working with CEO for the past year and several months, and I've learned a ton since I've been here. And as you mentioned, it's really altered my perspective. I'm
And
listening
let's
to
talk about
different,
that. Let's talk about that.
yeah.
How has it altered your perspective? And how also did it alter your perspective to the news of George Floyd's death when you heard about it?
Yeah. So because I was immersed in a different culture, I work with the formerly incarcerated. And so, of course, I'm immersed in a culture of people who've been in prison. And, like you mentioned, our population, I would say, is probably about 70% African American. And, there's other, of course, there's male, female, all different backgrounds coming in to our program. But I really started listening to their voices and their experience. And of course, my current supervisor is also a Black man. And so I have conversations with him all the time. I like to pass things that I'm thinking by him to see what his perspective is. And in fact, I told him that I was going to be doing this interview today, and I asked him if there was anything that he wanted me to add to this. And what he said is, he feels it's really, really important for white people to speak up right now. That, he's told me it's really important to him that he feels heard when I listen to him and when I speak up. And that's what's been missing before. So often we get defensive. And so I just listen. And listening's been really important as we've kind of come into this time period of the coronavirus as well. Listening to the voices of people of color, what they're saying about the coronavirus, has become really important to me. And, I often feel that that's missing from the dialogue that we see on Facebook and in the media, how they are impacted in a different way than white America by what's happening with this disease.
Say more about that. What are they communicating to you about that in your community of work?
Well, so of course they're scared too. And this disease, as any disease, disproportionately impacts them because they have less access to health care. They have less access to resources. And, most of the people in my program, they're coming out of prison, so they have to start with a job somewhere. So they are the essential workers.
Mm-hmm.
And they have to work to survive. When people come out of prison, the state of California gives them $200. Can you imagine starting off with $200? If they're lucky, they get to go into some sort of halfway house. But many of the folks that I'm working with are also homeless. They don't have any resources. Sometimes they don't have family. And they face multiple barriers trying to find work. So they're in survival mode. And the access to healthcare that they have is Medicare, and it's not always that good. And so they're much more likely to get sick. And because they're essential workers, they're also the ones that have to be in the public, working with customers in stores or out doing essential work, where they're much more exposed than those of us who can stay home. So I've been extraordinarily lucky to be able to continue to work and work from home while this whole thing has been going on. And so I've been listening to that. And, I think one of the things from their perspective, one of the things that really stands out to me is this whole thing about wearing a mask. I see the dialogue happening on Facebook, and some of the things that people are saying about wearing a mask, it's oppression, it feels like slavery. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, if you could just talk to the folks that I'm working with and see what their impression of making that statement would be. I actually mentioned it to Terrell, my boss, and he said, I'm really super offended by that, because, Black people have faced slavery in the past, and wearing a mask is nothing like what slavery is. And so to compare it to that, which I saw, pictures of people doing at protest, is like a slap in the face. It's like a total lack of understanding of what slavery truly is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think sometimes, our perspective is colored by our privilege, and
Mm-hmm.
we aren't even aware that we, because we're not standing in their shoes. I think it's really important for us to place ourselves in their shoes for a moment and try to see the world as best we can through their perspective. And it truly does change how you approach how you're looking at things.
Tell me a little bit more about that. What has that process been for you? Okay, masks is one part of it, but how else has your thinking shifted and your behavior shifted? Either in working with them, these folks who are largely men. Have you worked with women?
Yeah, we have about 90% men in our program.
Okay.
And, we do have women that come through our program. And most of the participants come to us through parole or probation. So they get referred to us.
Okay.
And they go through a process and orientation. And we actually put them to work while we're helping them learn how to interview, create a resume, and do all the things that they need to do to find a job.
Right. And I know you've been working with them, coaching them emotionally as well, helping them with
Yes.
figures and things like that. But let's get back to that question of how have your beliefs, your attitudes, and your behaviors changed as a result of working, or what are things you've discovered that you didn't realize was perhaps embedded racism, or white privilege ignorance, or whatever it is? Share a little bit what's been going on for you.
Yeah, so once I entered into this program, I started paying more attention to racism. I did some reading and understanding actually the roots of where racism comes from, which is it's an economic reality. And so the racism is kind of an excuse for enslaving people.
Mm-hmm.
And in Europe, that didn't happen to, just Africans that they were importing. It also happened to Slavic people. But the Slavic people actually, they did something in their countries to prevent the import of people into Portugal for slavery. And so with this economic advantage that the slavers had, they started to create this story about the Black race as being inferior, and then they imported it into this country.
Mm-hmm.
And the roots of the economics of this country come out of slavery, because there's lots of money to be made from enslaving people, and those roots have never quite left. They're still there. They're still in the way that we operate in this country. And so because I care so deeply for the people that I work with, I love them. It's incredible how much love that I have for them. It can't help but alter my perspective to look at the world through their eyes and the multiple barriers that they face. And the primary thing, because my work is with the formerly incarcerated, I look at those barriers in particular that the formerly incarcerated face. But I also know that in this country, we imprison mostly Black men. And so how they got to prison comes from trauma, the lack of resources that they have, the lack of education that they get in the places where they live, because we don't put resources into low-income areas for education. Resources for education come out of the communities that they're in, and the multiple barriers that they face around things like their hair looking professional, their name. So, you know, the Black community pulls names from Africa, and that's apparent when they apply for a job because it's on the resume, and those resumes often get set aside.
Mm.
They don't get hired. So there's, you know, we have these laws against discrimination, but the discrimination still happens. And so I'm aware of that, and I'm aware of it when I'm working with them. It isn't as if we're having a conversation about this topic when I'm working with them. I'm having conversations with them. A lot of the time it's helping them learn how to interview and create a resume, but you know, the emotional barrier is the first barrier. And there's a lot of feelings of not being good enough, or hopelessness that comes from having a record and being a people of color, and knowing that you're going to get rejected over and over again because of those two things. And it's very painful. And if you can imagine trying over and over and over again, and so often they will find a job and then the background check occurs and they get let go. So they're told that they're hired, and then they get let go because of the background check. And so over time, when that happens over and over again, they lose hope. And who can blame them?
So I just want to take a moment and take that in. You know, just have us take that in, and people who are watching take that in. Whoever it may be who's watching, whatever side, and just allowing ourselves to just feel the pain of that.
Yeah.
Just feel the pain of that, the pain that they're in every day around this, and the pain that you encounter with them to help them. I'd like to talk about two things. One is, what are ways out that you help them? How do you help them get out of that really tricky road? Are there some success stories? What are the ingredients of the success story? Or what are some ways you've seen some of these folks be able to transcend their experience? Again, you know, in the year plus that you've been working there, and I'm sure you'll be seeing more and more and more of that, be able to speak to it. But what are some of the ingredients for getting out of this quagmire, this downward spiral?
Yeah, it's a great question. And as you were asking me that question, I was thinking about one of our participants, Michael, and you might have noticed I've been smiling because I really love Michael, and what I've appreciated about him is his resilience. So this is a man who was in prison for nearly 30 years. And just imagine coming out of prison where you haven't had any access to technology or anything, and the whole world has transformed since you've been in.
Yeah, like 7 times over.
Yeah, like, I mean, it's just incredible. And you know, I remember when he came through our orientation class, he was just really in a state of dismay. And I think the thing that stood out to him the most, and what he said to me, is how much more cruel the world has become.
Yeah.
Since he went in. How people are not paying attention and they're not kind to each other anymore. And that really stood out to him. And, he really also kind of struggled with some of the changes in our culture around PC, so to speak, and particularly in relationship to how he learned to treat women and what impact that had now. So there was a big, huge learning curve for him. And unfortunately, he came out, he started in a halfway house, and then that didn't work out for him, and he ended up being homeless. And over and over and over again, his things got stolen. He had to replace his phone, I don't know how many times. He bought a tent, and they cleared the tent, they cleared everything out. They took all of his stuff, so he was just trying to survive and finding it very difficult. And there were times when he came into my office and he was so angry, and who could blame him? And he wanted to lash out and hurt somebody in the midst of that anger. And I would just sit with him and hold space for his feelings. And, if I said something that struck him the wrong way, he would push back hard. And, I really had to respect that. I think I made the mistake of saying once, "I understand." And he looked at me and he said, "No, you don't understand. You're not homeless. You don't know what it's like out there. It's like living like an animal." And I was like, wow, you're right. I don't understand. I'm not experiencing that. So that was one way that I've been learning, how to engage and what to say and when to hold space. And it's not an exercise in perfection by any means. I have to be open to that learning. But the thing that struck me about him was his resiliency, because he came back over and over and over again from these experiences and just kept trying. And, I think it helped for me to be there and hold space for that anger, and also to push him in areas where he had his own blind spots, to ask him questions so that he could see those blind spots. And he didn't always immediately receive that either. But where I came from was my heart. I came from loving him and wanting the best for him. And we navigated our way through it. And he did, the lion's share of the work. But he is now in a position where he's got a place to stay, and he recently found a job. And I am so excited for him.
Yeah.
And, he came back and he told me, "You've been like the mother to me that I never had. You pushed me in ways that nobody ever pushed me. And I know that you care about me." And he's doing a painting for me right now of a tree because he knows how much I love trees. So, we share other things as well. He has a love of roses. I have a love of roses. He loves nature. I love nature. And so we've had those conversations as well, connecting human to human.
Right.
So I think that story is the one that stands out to me the most, because it's been such a long haul for him. He came into our program late in the summer last year, and it's been more than half a year where he's been going through this process of being homeless and losing everything over and over and over again. And if we place ourselves in his shoes, I think to myself, I don't know if I would survive that. I don't know that I have quite the same level of resiliency that he has. His resiliency amazes me.
Yeah. And talk to me about trauma and how you help these people address their trauma. What is trauma? How is it affecting these folks that you're working with? And then how do you intercede to help them recognize or change a trauma response, perhaps?
Yeah, so I want to say first, I'm not a therapist. I'm not a trauma therapist. I've done a lot of my own independent research on trauma to understand it. And, you know, our organization is really trying hard to be very trauma informed. And so first of all, trauma, we often think of trauma as the event that happened, but trauma is a lasting impact after the event happens. And it can happen in many different ways. It can be emotional abuse. It can be abuse. It could be early childhood surgery. It could be an accident. Everybody responds differently to different situations, and the system gets overwhelmed. And that leads to an ongoing response to trauma. And I look at trauma from the standpoint of what I've learned about it as not just an emotional thing, but a nervous system adaptation. And so the nervous system gets rewired into either hypervigilance, which is where we're always on alert and we're always in a state of fear. And so it changes the tracks of our brain. And what it does is it takes away our ability to think clearly.
Yeah.
So our prefrontal cortex is the area in our brain which is most capable of thinking and empathy. And what trauma does is it rewires the brain to be in the lower brain, to be in the state of fear, which reduces our ability to think. And it's a body response. It's not just a mental thing. So, you know, I often will hear the POs, the probation officers or the parole officers that I work with saying, well, you know, they should have thought this through a little bit better. Well, the thing about trauma is once you get triggered, there isn't thought happening. It's a reaction. And you go back to a pattern that protected you during your trauma. And so if you think about being in prison in particular, there's no safety in prison. You have to be hypervigilant all the time. And trauma has impact on how we receive tone of voice, facial expressions, somebody's body language and aggressive stance. And we respond to that immediately, kind of on a gut level. And then when we're hypervigilant, we also don't see possibility in the world. So my first step is to educate them that trauma is a body response, that they don't necessarily have control over the responses to things. And the reason why I do that is so that they can step out of the self-blame and begin to look at their patterns and see that it's not that they're just a bad human being, that they're wrong, but that these patterns are there. And at some point, you know, we honor them. At some point, this pattern potentially saved a life, right? Is how I responded as a child when I was being abused, or it was how I had to be when I was in prison in order to survive. And so I start there by honoring, you know, you survived, you're here, and your pattern was part of the way that you got here. And now it's not serving you anymore. So what are we going to do different? So we have all these cognitive behavioral therapy exercises that we do in the classroom. The element that I bring in that's a little bit different is we have to start with the body first before we can start with the thinking. So cognitive behavioral therapy is all about thinking my way through differently than what I do in the past, right? Starting with the body, though, is incredibly important because we have to create some balance in our nervous system. And the way that I do that is to use some very simple techniques with them and encourage them to practice those techniques. So we do this technique in the classroom, and it's as simple as I just have them, and I'm going to do it right now, and I encourage everybody who's listening to do this with me right now and see what happens. But I encourage them to sit in their seat, and if it feels safe for them to close their eyes, they can close their eyes. I always make sure that I say if it feels safe, though, because not everybody feels safe with their eyes closed. So we have to honor that as well. And then what I ask them to do is just start by becoming aware of the surface of the bottom of their feet. And just notice what's touching and what's not touching. And so we're getting out of the mind and into the body, into a safe space. Typically, feet feel safe. I can get in touch with my feet, whereas I might not be able to get in touch with my body if I was traumatized there, but the feet are easy. And I ask them to stay with their feet and begin to notice their fingertips. And so if you notice your fingertips right now, you might notice they are extraordinarily sensitive, inside and out. You might notice a tingling there in your fingertips. And this starts to slow us down and help us pay attention to our body and what's going on in our body. Sometimes I tell them to imagine, so they can slow down, that they have roots coming out of their fingertips and into the ground. And those roots are flexible so they can still move around, but they're rooted. And they're also rooted through their feet. And I help them notice that gravity holds them perfectly. They have the freedom to move, and yet they're safe against the earth, safe on those feet. And then if they can, I ask them to become aware of their breath and notice the sound of the breath as it moves through their throat, and notice what's moving in their body. And it tends to slow things down. It tends to soften things. And now they have a technique that they can use anywhere they go, at any point. This technique also works beautifully for them in interviewing. There's no more nerve-wracking situation than going into an interview. And so I actually, one of the tools that I use in teaching them is we do mock interviews in the classroom. And I might have someone come up and interview in front of the whole group. And if their nervousness is really showing through with that interview, I take them through this technique, and there is a marked difference between the first interview and the second interview. Wow. I do that on purpose because I'm teaching not only the person who's doing the interview, but I'm teaching the people in the classroom how effective just this simple technique of calming the nervous system can be for altering how you're approaching something. So what we're doing here is we're working with what's called the parasympathetic nervous system, the part of our nervous system that calms us down. Mm-hmm. You know, we have the sympathetic and we have the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is when we're ramped up, you know, whether we're nervous or afraid, or, you know, we're engaged with some really active exercise or something like that, you know, our heart rate is up. And so really what is at the base of true health is being able to balance out the nervous system so that you can move from the sympathetic, the hyper engaged, back again to just alert, calm awareness. Our ability to move between those two states easily is what leads to more balance in our life. And what that does is it opens up our brain so that we have different channels of being able to see possibility. So the key to this whole thing, though, is you have to work on it. And this is the thing that I try to work with them. You know, are you using these techniques on your own? It takes practice. It's not an instant fix.
Yes.
So our culture wants an instant fix all the time. We're all seeking that, not just the formerly incarcerated, all of us. I want instant fixes. You know, I want my pain to be gone now. And it doesn't work that way. We have to practice it. We have to create new tracks in our brain. And that's what we're doing when we're working with our nervous system.
And it seems to me that this is something that you have brought into CEO, correct? I mean, it wasn't really so much there. It was more get the resume, get the job, get them out, get them situated, right? Is this something, a piece that you've brought in from your background then?
Yes, and I would say that CEO as an organization is also working across the board to be more trauma informed.
Yeah.
So since I've been there, that has started to transform. Yeah, originally their focus was, move them through as quickly as possible to get a job. The belief that that's going to create more stability in their life and reduce recidivism, which is the return over and over again to prison. But it's much bigger than that. And I think the organization as a whole has recognized how much bigger it is than just finding a job. And so we consider ourselves to be trauma informed, and how we approach our participants and each other is trauma informed. And this is starting to, spread out throughout the entire organization. There are other people that I've been working with inside the organization on, how can we be more trauma informed, and how can we bring those things into our work with the participants. So my particular take on it, working with the nervous system, I think is a little unique from the rest of the trauma informed, but that's because I've been educating myself so deeply on that and working really with my own nervous system around this, and recognizing that actually, I'll share a little story. The work that I've done up to this point, the path that I've gone down, the mysticism that I explored, I've recognized that some of the things that I learned in that path, coming from a spiritual point of view, were actually things that I was working with my nervous system. And
Yeah.
so, coming now around from the body perspective, oh, well, this is what I've been doing all along.
Yeah.
And I didn't recognize the nervous system part of it. So it's really fascinating.
Very interesting how all these threads of your life are coming together. So, Maura, what is your commitment to shifting the reality of racism in this country? What are you doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something that I've been thinking about a lot. I think that the work that I'm doing with the formerly incarcerated is a lot, but I've recognized recently it's not enough. I can't just rest on my laurels there, so to speak. And so I've made a commitment that I'm going to do one thing per day to combat racism. And I found this great article on medium.com, which is 75 things that white people can do for racial justice. And I've decided.
You know what? I'd like us to include that as a link under this video. So I'll get that link from you.
Yeah. So I'm just going through the list and doing one thing per day. What I've already done is, yesterday I donated to an organization that's combating racism, and I'll probably sprinkle donations to different organizations. One of the other suggestions was, find out if your local police department are required to wear cameras. And so I did actually look up, I live in Concord, California, so I did look up the Concord police and found that they are required to wear cameras. And so the suggestion is, if they aren't wearing cameras, then, write the mayor, write a letter to the commissioner of police or whatever, making that request. And so doing one thing per day, and then I know that I'm actually doing something to create a shift. So that's one thing. The other thing is listening to people of color on any commentary, that's anything that's going on in our world. I want to listen to the voices of people of color and see what their perspective is and what they have to say about it. And the other thing that I'm doing is I'm calling people out on Facebook. So just trying to find, I don't always do this well, but trying to find a way to insert into the conversation, have you considered how your perspective here is coming from a place of privilege, if it seems like it's coming from that, so that I can educate and ask people questions. I've been told from Terrell, my boss, and from other people in my organization how important it is for us as white people to take a stand for them. Because them taking a stand for them is not going to change anything. Us taking a stand for them is going to change things. And so we have to do our own deep shadow work. And it's painful sometimes to recognize how we have these blind spots. I think part of what I've noticed about being white middle class is this desire inside me to be perfect all the time. And I have to watch that. That's my shadow. Because in this need to be perfect, sometimes I respond to things kind of from a place of, they talk about white fragility. And I think that that's really what it is, my need to be perfect overrides my connection to other people sometimes. I get triggered and I react. And so I have to watch my own triggers. And I really have to step back. And sometimes I have to take a moment and not say anything and work on my own shadow stuff before I say anything. And so this is a skill that I'm learning, to pause before I respond. And then try to come with a respond with the ultimate goal of transforming. I don't want to be attacking. I want to be helping someone else transform their perspective. And so that, I feel, is a huge responsibility that I'm taking on right now. And I'll learn as I go.
Yeah, wow. Well, I think it's good that we're focusing this conversation on the small steps, because I think that a lot of people look at what's going on right now and just say, oh gosh, it's so big. There's so many layers. There's so much history. There's so much entwined trauma. How can we ever deal with this, And so I'm
So
liking starting with the body, and I'm liking
yeah.
starting with some of these suggestions, and then the others that we will be making available.
So I'd like to add one more thing here, because I think it's so important to look at this too. So I think a big, huge part of what we have right now is a crisis of belonging. And I think it's so important for us to recognize what it means to be human. So to be human means that it's so critically important to us to belong and to feel safe in our belonging. It's who we are as human beings. And so much of American culture is a mythology of individualism and do-it-yourselfness. And nobody accomplishes anything on their own. And it's extraordinarily painful when we don't belong. And so we have a crisis of belonging on all sides. And I think that in particular, men learn at a very early age that they have to be strong, they have to be masculine. We actually cut off their emotional growth at a very early age and teach them to be competitive, and our definition of masculine, which is never vulnerable. I don't need anybody else, right? And so they don't know how to do that. They learn that their belonging is based upon their strength and their ability to do things on their own and independently, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of stuff, right? And they risk more than women do by being vulnerable, because what they're risking in their minds is their belonging. And so, sometimes this reaction that we see kind of culturally from that patriarchal perspective is fear of not belonging coming out as what you might say is toxic masculinity, the way that men aren't naturally that way. You know, what I've learned in doing this work is that men are extraordinarily sensitive beings, and they have to spend their entire life pretending that they're not.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got to stop pretending that we're not human. We've got to stop pretending that belonging doesn't matter to us. And you know, what we're seeing is this crisis in people of color not being invited into the culture, not being able to belong, and they don't feel safe. We all need that safety, and we all need to recognize that we need each other. We need each other so deeply. And yeah, it's important to be able to do things on our own, but it's not as important as being able to do them together.
That's beautiful.
It's who we are as human beings.
So I guess I want to tie this back in our last few minutes together. Tie this back into what's the recent events, which are but one of many types of events that have gone on in recent decades and then going before. Is there anything you'd like to say or bring in, or a prayer perhaps even? Because I think it's like we can mean so well and sometimes stumble in that well-meaning, and it just feels like, I don't know, I personally feel like I need a higher spiritual guidance, you know, for us. So how would you like to use these last 5 minutes or so?
So if I was going to say a prayer, what I would say...
You can lead us if you'd like. Yeah.
So pause for a moment. Feel your feet. Feel your fingertips. Become aware of your breath. From there, move into your heart. Maybe place a hand on your heart. And let's recognize together one very simple truth about why we're here. It's so simple. We're here to love. Bottom line, that's it. That's our job. It's to love. And if we can tap into that love every time we're doing other things, and love ourselves first, love ourselves enough that we can love ourselves through our mistakes, because we are going to make mistakes. Mistakes is the way that we learn. Let that perfect love that is, however you see that higher power, let that love imbue your heart with golden light, with its beautiful softness and its gentle expansion. And let that radiate out from you. And let that love inform your response. Even if that response is anger, it is okay to be angry sometimes. Anger is a boundary setter, and we need to be angry for other people. sometimes too. Don't be afraid of that anger, but make sure it's based in love. So if you can tap into feeling that love, you can do anything. And you can transform this world one step at a time. Bring that love to whoever you meet. Blessed be.
Blessed be. That's so beautiful. It really all comes down to that ultimately. And I have received so many times in intuitions and ceremonies that if we were able to get to that calm, clear place of true love, well-being, everything would shift overnight on this planet.
Yeah.
And beyond. And it's about getting to that place and getting the tools so that we can address what's going on within ourselves, what's going on in our world from that place of love, and make different decisions, approach situations differently, shift them, So may it be so. This or better for the greatest good of all.
Yeah.
And may this love go out to all the people involved in this situation, in the core of it and the concentric rings of it. And may this energy assist with the healing and the unity, the restoration of unity that we so need.
And I want to say thank you, Marguerite, for asking me to come on and share my perspective and the perspective of the people that I work with. Thank you.
Be. You're so welcome. It couldn't have been more timely. It just seemed to emerge this week. Oh gosh,
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, Maura. I really appreciate it. And also for the work that you're doing and for the teaching that you're doing now as well, and larger rings about this. And may you be blessed, and may the people that you're working with be blessed with assistance and support and love and peace and safety, so that they may go forward with healing and with creativity in their lives to have beautiful lives.
Blessed be.
Blessed be. All right, sister. Well, with that, we'll say goodbye. We'll say goodbye to everybody watching. Thank you so much for watching this Priestess Dialogue, and may we all be inspired wherever we are, whoever we are, to assist with this great healing.
Yes.
Blessed be.
Blessed be.